Spider-Man. What else is there to be said about this pop culture mainstay? Ever since he made his debut on the pages of Amazing Fantasy number 15 back in August of 1962 in the Silver Age of comic books, he has become one of the most recognizable figures in the superhero genre, and in the eyes of many, he is on the Mount Rushmore of superheroes alongside Batman and Superman. To think though, when he made his debut in Amazing Fantasy, the comic itself was on the verge of cancellation, until the publisher Martin Goodman saw the sales figures, and according to Stan Lee,
he said, "You know, Stan, you remember that Spider-Man character of yours that we both liked so much? Why don't we do a series about it?"
From there, Spider-Man took off in the comic book world, and he would go on from strength to strength, appearing in other mediums like TV shows, animation, and other marketable mediums. There is a lot to get into regarding Spider-Man's incredible history, but I'm keeping it to the medium of movies. So today, I discussed the film that brought Spider-Man's already incredible legacy to brand new heights. I discussed the 2002 Spider-Man movie starring Tobey Maguire. Now, when the movie first came about, I was not at all familiar with Tobey. He had starred in a number of notable films prior, like The Wonder Boys, Pleasantville, and Ride with the Devil, but I was unfamiliar with his work. But by the end of this movie, he had won me over, and I was looking forward to further appearances from him in future Spider-Man films. Now, a little history lesson in the development of Spider-Man the movie. So, here we go. Development on a live-action Spider-Man goes back as far as 1975. At one point, several notable filmmakers were attached to direct the film, including famously James Cameron of Terminator fame. However, the project would languish in development hell for nearly 25 years due to licensing and financial issues. Then it was finally licensed for a worldwide release by Columbia Pictures in 1999, after it acquired options from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer on all previous scripts that were developed by Cannon Films, Carolco, and New Cannon. Sony hired David Coop to create a working screenplay. This was credited as Cameron's, and Coop received sole credit in the final billing. Directors Ang Lee, Chris Columbus, Barry Sonnenfeld, Tim Burton, Michael Bay, Tony Scott, and David Fincher were amongst the directors considered to direct the project before Sam Raimi was hired as the director in the year 2000. Filming took place in Los Angeles and New York City from January to June of 2001. Danny Elfman of Batman fame was hired to compose the film's score, while Sony Pictures Image handled the film's visual effects. The role of Spider-Man itself had plenty of well-known actors considered for the role, including Leonardo DiCaprio, Freddie Prinze Jr., Chris O'Donnell, Jude Law, Chris Klein, Ewan McGregor, and the late Heath Ledger. Now ultimately, as we know, Tobey Maguire landed the role. I do wonder though how things would have panned out if Leonardo DiCaprio had gotten the role, given his immense popularity, and also he's very good buddies with Tobey. The other cast members are Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson, who at that point was on a good streak of starring in very popular movies like Bring It On and Get Over It. The role of Norman Osborn went to veteran actor Willem Dafoe, whom I was familiar with given his roles in Body of Evidence and Speed 2. James Franco plays Harry Osborn, Peter's best friend and son to Norman Osborn. Veteran English actress Rosemary Harris plays the role of Aunt May in a very convincing and engaging manner. And then there is J.K. Simmons, who plays a very comic-accurate J. Jonah Jameson. If there was any actor born to play the role of J. Jonah Jameson, Simmons was the guy. A little side note, Stan Lee had wanted to play the role of JJ on screen, but for this movie the producers felt Stan was just too old to play the role, and he agreed. Plus he was a huge fan of Simmons' portrayal of the character and felt he did a better job than he could have ever done. He did of course go on to have several cameos in various Marvel films right up until Avengers Endgame. Of all the casting members of this film, I have to say Dunst is a brilliant actress, but I was not the biggest fan of her version of Mary Jane. Now personally, if I had to have picked an actress from this time period, I would have gone for Jennifer Love Hewitt. That's just my personal choice. There were other actresses up for the role like Kate Bosworth, Mina Savari, and Eliza Dushku. Now that I've gone through some of the behind the scenes tidbits, I will now give a summary of the movie from start to finish, so let's get into it. The film opens up with some brilliant visual effects and on-screen display graphics playing to the score by Danny Elfman. We hear the voice of Peter Parker narrating his life and how it was far from normal. He is seen in the beginning chasing after the school bus, much to the amusement of other kids. And once he's on board, you see just how horrible his life as a young student is, getting picked on by the jocks and mocked by everyone else, and not being able to get the girl. The girl in this case being Mary Jane Watson. The school bus arrives at a university genetics laboratory. There the movie introduces Harry Osborn and his father, Norman. At the lab, Peter is bitten by an escaped radioactive spider. Back home, he heads to his room where he passes out. Now we see the cool CGI of his DNA being transformed. He then wakes up, and there have been huge changes to his physique. And he no longer needs his glasses, and he has enhanced reflexes. His Uncle Ben and his Aunt May are his legal guardians, and they are curious as to what is happening to him. Back at school, he accidentally flings a plate of food onto the local school jock and bully, Flash Thompson. This leads to a fight in which Peter emerges victorious, much to the astonishment of the onlookers, especially Harry and Mary Jane. Peter ends up in an alleyway and he discovers his new powers, being able to leap distances, climb onto walls, and shoot spiderwebs from his hands, a completely different take on the character as opposed to the usual lore of creating web shooters to wear on his wrist. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn's company, Oscorp, is in danger of missing out on an important military contract with his super serum considered too dangerous and unstable. Desperate and low on time, Norman proceeds to test his latest update of the serum on himself, much to the worry of his assistant, who wants him to wait until it is 100% safe. Norman ignores his advice, and during the process, Norman becomes engulfed with the formula, and then he ends up snapping and killing his assistant in the process. He's later found by Harry in his office, but he has no recollection of what happened, and he is updated on his assistant's death and the suit and the glider which were stolen. Norman later realizes that he was behind the murder as he sees his reflection in a mirror, but not as himself but as his alter ego, the Green Goblin, driven completely mad by the serum and has created a split personality. With his newfound abilities, Peter decides to use them to his advantage to make some money so he can go and buy a car just to impress Mary Jane. He ends up in an underground wrestling event where he's forced into a cage fight with its champion wrestler, Buzzsaw, played by the late great wrestling icon Macho Man Randy Savage. After an intense fight, he is victorious, but then he's swindled out of the money he thought that he would be getting for the fight by the promoter. Peter angrily walks away, but there is a commotion happening when a robber holds up the promoter and takes his money. The robber runs past Peter, who lets him by, a decision that would prove fatal. Early on, Peter had an argument with his Uncle Ben before going into his wrestling match with Buzzsaw. He did tell Peter these very famous words.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
On his way back, he discovers a crowd gathering with police rushing to the scene. He gets close by and then he discovers the victim has been shot and is horrified to see that it is his Uncle Ben. Peter grabs his hand, but Ben slowly dies. Now in a complete vengeful state, Peter goes after the suspect after overhearing from the police radio that he's been cornered in an abandoned warehouse. Peter comes face to face with the crook, only to shockingly discover that it was the very same guy that had robbed the wrestling promoter. In a struggle, the robber accidentally trips and falls to his death. Peter later reflects on his uncle's words and decides to use his new abilities for good, and then he becomes the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He takes on petty crooks and gangs and keeps the streets of New York safe. His exploits catch the eye of Daily Bugle editor J. Jonah Jameson, played to comic book accurate perfection by J.K. Simmons. JJ decides to make Spider-Man infamous by basically spreading tabloid slander about him. Peter ends up as the unofficial designated freelance photographer for Spider-Man when he goes for a photography job that was advertised at the Bugle. He has to settle for being a freelancer. In the meantime, Norman is wreaking havoc as the Green Goblin when he kills several people who are testing out a new exoskeleton for his Oscorp rivals. After being kicked out by Oscorp by the directors, he gets his revenge, disguised as the Green Goblin, killing them during a parade. It is here that the Goblin first comes face to face with Spider-Man. On top of the fight, Spider-Man has to save MJ from falling to her doom. And it wouldn't be the first time in this movie. In fact, it was going to be a recurring theme in all these Spider-Man Sam Raimi movies. With Spider-Man now in the picture, Norman decrees that they either team up or Spider-Man be permanently eliminated. He attacks the Bugle and threatens Jameson until Spider-Man makes the save. He's then blindsided by the Goblin with knockout gas, and in a paralyzed state, Spider-Man is helpless as the Goblin offers him a chance to join him. We skip to Peter catching up with MJ as she finishes a shift at the diner where she worked while she's looking to become an actress. MJ is then ambushed by some thugs in an alleyway before being saved by Spider-Man. This whole scene feels very Batman-esque, especially with the score playing in the background. There was also the scene of the very famous upside down kiss between Spidey and MJ. Next we move to a burning building and Spider-Man arrives on the scene to make the rescue. There is one last victim to save, but it turns out to be the Goblin in disguise, and he attacks Spider-Man. During the fight, Spider-Man is cut by one of the Goblin's weapons, and he escapes with the Goblin vowing to get him back for refusing to join him. Norman then arrives at Harry's place to meet Mary Jane, whom Harry is now dating. Aunt May is there preparing them dinner. Peter arrives late, and as things get underway, Norman discovers a cut on Peter's arm, which he brushes off as an accident with a bike messenger. But Norman realizes that Peter is Spider-Man. He abruptly leaves the dinner, but not before letting Harry know what he really thinks of Mary Jane, much to her disgust. Back at his mansion, he decides to attack Spider-Man, but by going after his loved ones. First, he attacks Aunt May at her home and frightens her, which leads her to going to the hospital. Then after learning from Harry that MJ may have feelings for Peter, Norman captures MJ and lures Spider-Man to the Brooklyn Bridge. There, he also attacks a tram car full of young children and leaves Spider-Man with a dilemma: save Mary Jane or save the kids. Through sheer determination and quick thinking, Spider-Man saves them both. But the triumph is short-lived as he is attacked by the Goblin, who sends him flying into an abandoned building, where a final confrontation ensues with a very hard-hitting, brutal beatdown. The Goblin gets the upper hand, but in typical supervillain fashion, he lets it slip about how he will finish off his loved ones, with Mary Jane being the target. Spider-Man finds the strength to recover and beats down the Goblin. Just as Spider-Man is winning, the Goblin tries to play with his emotions by revealing himself as Norman Osborn. Spider-Man is stunned and angry at the Goblin. This gives a few seconds to the Goblin to attempt to impale Spider-Man with his glider, but thanks to his spider sense, he moves out of the way just in the nick of time, with the glider instead impaling Osborn. As he is writhing in pain, he pleads with Spider-Man not to tell Harry his secret, and then he dies. Spider-Man carries him back to the mansion where Harry sees him and wrongly and angrily thinks that Spider-Man killed his dad. At the funeral, there is a very tense and emotional exchange between Harry and Peter, with Harry vowing on his father's grave that he will one day kill Spider-Man, but he declared Peter as his only real family, which left Peter in a very emotionally precarious position. Also at the funeral, Mary Jane declares her love for Peter, but he rejects her, owing to his secret identity as Spider-Man, fearing his enemies could target her the same way the Goblin did. Mary Jane suddenly gets a familiar feeling about their kiss and suspects that Peter could indeed be Spider-Man. But that is for another time. As Peter leaves the funeral, he recounts his late Uncle Ben's words, and he declares, "With great power comes great responsibility."
This is my gift, my curse. Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
And the movie comes to an end. Spider-Man was a massive critical success at the box office, becoming the first film to pass the $100 million mark in a single weekend. Now, even when you adjust for inflation in today's market, it is still over $114 million plus gross, establishing a new opening weekend record. The gross had surpassed the previous record, which is held by Harry Potter's The Sorcerer's Stone, which was $19.3 million. On top of that, Spider-Man received rave and critical reviews, with Rotten Tomatoes giving it a 90% score of 249 critic reviews, and stating, "Not only does Spider-Man produce a good dose of web-swinging fun, it also has a heart, thanks to the combined charms of director Sam Raimi and the star Tobey Maguire." Now, there was a growing trend in the rise of comic book hero movie adaptations during this period, which could be traced back to 1996's Blade with Wesley Snipes, and then the Fox X-Men movies with Hugh Jackman. Given Spider-Man is the most popular hero from Marvel and certainly one of the all-time superhero greats on Mount Rushmore, it was probably not the biggest surprise that Spider-Man pulled in these very impressive figures. Now, my personal take on the movie is how comic book accurate it is. did very well to tell an origin story whilst introducing the characters and staying true to their backgrounds from the comics. It feels very grounded with Peter's struggles as a young student dealing with being a social outcast, being bullied, and living with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May, who were dealing with the harsh realities of life and not having a lot of money to live comfortably. I mean, this element of the Spider-Man lore was captured to perfection, and it's very relatable to real life. The background music scores are excellent, the special effects look a little suspect in some cases, but on the whole, I thought they were very good. There were some differences to the comics. For instance, the biggest one is Spider-Man's web shooters. Unlike the comics and the animated versions, his webbing comes directly from glands in his wrist, which I personally prefer to his web shooters. It's a nice little change from the norm, but it doesn't deter from the character as a whole, in my opinion. The other difference was Mary Jane and the lack of Gwen Stacy. Yes, Gwen Stacy comes into the picture, but not until the third movie. In the comics lore, Gwen was Peter's first true love, although him and MJ do meet up in the comics thanks to being set up by their aunts, and MJ also gave her a very famous line,
"Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot."
This line was not mentioned in this movie, and apparently Pete and MJ had known each other since they were little kids, so that was a little departure from the regular norm of Spider-Man and his love life. And having Gwen come in later, I personally would have preferred if she had featured here first, and given that the Goblin is the main villain, we all know what happened to Gwen in the comics, that could have really added to the drama in this movie. James Franco's portrayal of Harry is very good. Even though he is Pete's best friend, he does come off as something of a backstabbing weasel, especially after he goes after MJ after Pete fumbled his chance. Over the course of the movie trilogy, you see his descent into darkness, and it starts in this film when he thinks Spider-Man killed his father, and eventually by the third movie he became his own version of the Goblin. This is an arc to be further looked at when I do future videos on the other two Spider-Man Sam Raimi movies. Both Willem Dafoe and J.K. Simmons nailed their characters. Norman in one instance is a very likeable and charming man, and you can't help but like the rapport between him and Peter very early on in the movie. And then in another instant, he's this mad, conniving, diabolical villain with no moral compass, and Dafoe plays it brilliantly, differentiating between Norman and the Goblin. Of all the Spider-Man villains that we have seen on screen, Dafoe's portrayal of the Goblin is without a doubt my favourite of the Spider-Man rogue gallery. J.K. Simmons, I've already mentioned what a superb display he has as J. Jonah Jameson, like being ripped straight from the comic books to the big screen. They had tried for decades to get Spider-Man onto the big screen, and this outing was a big success story, and it paved the way for all the other Spider-Man movies to come along afterwards. Of all these Spider-Man films, this remains my favourite of all time, and I listed it as number 2 in my all-time comic book movies ever. It is a great origin story grounded in some reality that tells the story of a boy who overcame various adversities and tragedies, who accepted his responsibilities and grew into a superhero. The movie has the right balance of drama and action. Plot-wise, I don't feel it's too overly convoluted. It stuck to the guidelines that were set out in the comics, and barring some changes here and there, produced not just an excellent comic book movie adaptation, but an excellent movie as a whole. There have been about 8 Spider-Man live-action movies. I'm discounting these Spider-Verse films, and this Spider-Man movie was the one that got the ball rolling. It is a true cult superhero classic.